Hi, everybody, and welcome to the next edition of Foods to Become Friends With. And the topic today will be pulses. So you might be asking yourself, what exactly is a pulse? I'm not talking here about the pulse of your heartbeat, for example. A pulse in French is called a légumineuse, so a bit more descriptive. But a pulse is a dried edible seed of a plant that is in the legume family. And I know that that sounds a little bit confusing. What's the difference between a legume and a légumineuse? But basically it has to do with the fact that you can eat these dry or that they're harvested dry. So like a pea, for example, has a version that you can harvest while it's still green on the pod. And the green pea that you see over here, right here, that's been left on the plant to dry. And so all of these are grown in the same way. In any case, it's not really important how they're grown, but this is a family of foods that is very important for anybody adopting a plant-based diet. And I would say also anybody who's wanting to reduce meat consumption. And you see the incredible diversity of foods that are within this family. So you have peas and beans and chickpeas and lentils. So what are the characteristics of pulses and why should you become friends with them? First of all, pulses are extremely nutritious across the board. All of them contain very high levels of protein, fiber, iron, and other nutrients. And you can see that in the chart here, even though there is some variation depending on the particular type of pulse that you're eating, they all relatively share a similar nutritional composition. And all of those nutrients that are listed there are very important for body functioning, for reducing your chances of certain cancers, heart disease, diabetes, etc. There's a lot of studies that have shown, for example, the more fiber consumption you have, then it lowers your chance, for example, of colon cancer. Potassium is also a very important nutrient that is essential to lowering your risk for heart disease and things like that. So basically, you really can't go wrong. Any of the pictures that I showed you on the last page, any of these types of foods are going to be extremely nutritious. And I didn't really know about these until I traveled in India. And I kind of joked that I didn't know what a lentil was until I was 22 years old because I never ate those things when I was growing up in the US on a standard American diet, eating a lot of fast food. And then all of a sudden I go to a country where people are eating lentils 2 or 3 times a day, oftentimes in very tasty preparation, I might add. And I discovered that, yeah, you can actually be very healthy. And another advantage is that they're very inexpensive as well. And for that, reason and more, in 2016, the United Nations declared that pulses were the food of the year, and they went on a bit of a public relations campaign to try to get more people more aware of the fact that this is a very nutritious food, a type of food, and the environmental impact is very low, as we'll see in a second. And as I mentioned, they are very inexpensive. Another thing, did you know that actually Canada produced 8.4 million tons of pulses in 2016, and that Canada is the #1 world producer of lentils. And you can see on the map there that most of the lentils are produced in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and that we account for 95% of world production. Here in Quebec, we can't really grow chickpeas or lentils, or peas so much, but this is a very good region to grow beans. So black beans and kidney beans, things like that. So actually, if you are wanting to move towards a plant-based diet and eating somewhat local and lowering your environmental impact in terms of transportation is important to you, then lentils would be a really food that would be high on the list, or anything else that is produced in Canada. And yet, most of what Canada produces is exported. So, there is a domestic market here for these types of foods that you could participate in, but most of what is grown in Canada is actually being sent abroad. Okay, so as I mentioned before, all of these are relatively inexpensive, especially if you buy them in their dried form. So you may go to the supermarket and find cans of chickpeas or lentils that have already been rehydrated. And in general, the more steps of processing and the more packaging you have on something, the more expensive it is. But if you can find pulses in their dried form, which are oftentimes hidden at the very back of supermarkets, I think probably because the supermarket has a very low profit margin on them because they're so inexpensive, then that's the way to go if you're really on a budget. You can get a lot more of the dried form of the pulse than if you get it in a can where it's already been mixed with water and oftentimes salt as well. So in addition to being healthy and inexpensive, as I said, pulses in general have a very low environmental impact, and that they can actually be beneficial for soils. So according to the Pulse Growers of Canada, they have a lower carbon footprint than most foods because they require, first of all, a small amount of fertilizer to grow, and they have a special relationship with certain bacteria in the soil that have the ability to convert nitrogen in the air into a form of nitrogen that plants can use. So in addition, pulses are a protein source with a very low water footprint. So actually, for farmers for a very long time, rotated the crops in their field. So one year they would grow wheat, and the next year they would grow corn, and then the next year they would grow some form of pulse because they understood that the soil's nutrients were actually replenished when they grew pulses. And then they would often leave their fields fallow for a year. They would leave them to rest. But when you have good crop rotation like that and you involve pulses, it can actually improve the quality of the soil. And in some cases, the pulses are actually self-fertilizing because they can absorb the nitrogen from the air, which eliminates or reduces the need for traditional fertilizer. So you can see a chart that I have here on the left about per kilogram of CO2 per consumed food. And this chart is a bit different than you saw in the cooking class just now, because as I explained, that chart in the cooking class takes into account the full carbon imprint of the food that includes land use chains and transportation and packaging and all that stuff. This is a chart that just takes into account the actual emissions that are produced by producing that food and the processing and the transport. So it does not account for land change or any other factor. And as I said, when I presented that chart, in the cooking class, sometimes based on what you're calculating, you see slightly different figures, but you almost always see the same type of story, that very high up on the list of foods that add CO2 to the atmosphere per kilo, you have lamb and beef. In this case, they're reversed from the chart that we saw earlier, but that's because they don't take into account the land use. But there's very little debate about how usually lamb and beef are the top 2 or the top 3 foods with the highest carbon footprint. And then you have lower down the list cheese, pork, salmon, again, turkey, chicken. So recalling what I said before about how if you want to move away from any animal products, start with lamb and beef first. Pork and chicken have a lower environmental impact if that's what you're concerned with. But the thing that's very interesting here is that you see way, way, way down on the list here, lentils only accounting for 0.9 kilos of CO2 emissions per kilo of product. So if you're concerned about your environmental impact, then look at how much more lentils you can eat for the same amount of pollution as an animal-based product like lamb or beef. So how do we prepare pulses? There are lots of different ways to prepare, and I'm going to provide you with a recipe for the next cooking class. So if you buy pulses in the dried variety, which I suggested as a way of keeping your costs down, all you have to do is let them soak overnight. So put them in a bowl and then fill up the water to a couple inches above the line of the dried pulse, and just let them soak overnight. And then in the morning, or whenever you get to them the next day, just rinse them off, and then you can throw them directly into a stovetop saucepan or in a slow cooker, or if you have an instant pot, and you can just add in whatever spices, bouillon, vegetables, along with some water, maybe some coconut milk if you want to, get really exotic or something like that, and just turn it on and let it sit. Oftentimes I'll set chickpeas to start in my slow cooker in the morning, turn it on, go to work, I get back and my meal for dinner is ready, and I can cook big quantities of that at a time, which is, I think, one of the main advantages when you're a student is that sometimes you're eating by yourself or with only a few other people, and you don't really want to go to the effort of cooking like a huge meal just for yourself. But if you cook like this with pulses and you cook up a big batch, then you can eat a meal right then and then put them in Tupperware in the freezer for later on, so that then, later in the week or the next week, you can just take it out and then you already have your dinner prepared. But if you don't want to prepare a meal that is exclusively with the pulse, like with the lentil or the chickpea or the bean, then you could still try the same idea with a meat dish. So you could be cooking meat in a saucepan or a slow cooker and maybe try to reduce the amount of meat that you have by throwing in chickpeas or lentils or something like that. So the nutritional content of the dish would increase and the amount of meat that you would need would decrease, and you would probably also save money as a result. Or if you don't want to actually cook a pulse, then there is a way of sprouting it. So it's kind of the same idea as the previous thing that I described about letting them soak overnight. But if you continue to let them soak and you change the water every day, then you'll notice over here on the right, we have chickpeas, and you can see these little tails that stick out from them. That's what happens when the chickpea begins to sprout, which should take about 2 or 3 days. And then when the chickpea sprouts, you can actually eat it raw. You don't have to cook it. And those can be started from the dry variety, which are very, very hard, and you don't want to try to eat a raw pulse. But if you let them soak in water, after a couple of days, they'll turn up like that. Or on the top here, you have mung beans. You might not know what mung beans are, but you can probably find them in most stores if you look around. These little green beans, and after a couple of days, they look like that. They become very crunchy, very nutritious. They can add a lot of flavor to your dishes, and you can just sprinkle them on to, say, a salad, or if you have a pasta dish, or if you just want to have a snack, you want to get filled up, take some sprouted chickpeas. It'll fill you up really well because they contain such high nutrients, and it's going to cost you very little as well. So I wish I would have known about that when I was a student, instead of going and getting like chips or candy or something like that. If you have dried sprouted chickpeas or sprouted mung beans, then you can fill yourself up and do it cheaper and get better nutrition out of it. What to look out for when we're talking about pulses? Like, are there any concerns like we might have had with soy? Well, I think the biggest obstacle that you're going to find in pulses is the possibility that they might generate gas in your system. So, beans are a pulse, and you probably heard all the jokes about beans. And that just has to do with the nature of the food. But if you follow the instructions of soaking your pulse at night and cooking them thoroughly, and then when you're cooking them, you'll see that there is a thin line of bubbles that bubbles up to the top after about 20 or 30 minutes. If you just take a spoon and skim off the bubbles that rise to the top, that's what's going to cause your flatulence. So if you take the time while it's cooking to kind of skim that off, then you'll reduce the chance for gaseousness later on. And the other thing is that if your system is not used to this type of food, then you might want to increase your intake of them gradually to give your system a chance to adjust. But over time, your tolerance for that will increase, and your body won't produce as much gas once you get used to them. The other thing to note with red kidney beans in particular, it contains a particular compound that can actually make you sick if it's not cooked thoroughly. So kidney beans are the only one in this group of food that you need to watch out for to really make sure to thoroughly cook. So if you're making a chili, make sure it's been cooking for 8 hours or something like that. But most of the time you shouldn't have to worry about that. And if you get kidney beans in a can, then you probably shouldn't have to worry about that either. So that's about all I have to say about pulses and what they're good for. And I hope that you go and experiment with